Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Flashback to the Track. And it's a very special episode. Well, just like every episode is, but this one's very special because we have a guest. We have the man from Champ Web himself, Don Sklenka. Don, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks to have me on. I mean, this is definitely a special episode, so we need to make that clear.
And James is also here as always. James, I guess you should say hi as well.
Oh, hello. We survived Christmas in America, man. That was crazy. Not really. It was pretty chill. Though the day after Christmas in the mall, that was kind of cutthroat. So I hope everybody survived that.
Yeah, I did actually go to a mall on Boxing Day, which was the first time I've been in a mall in a really long time, but it was connected to the gym I went to. We were like at my in-laws parents' house, so we went to the gym and it was connected, and we had to go cash our scratch tickets because you always get scratch tickets in your stocking, right?
No,
so
I don't.
Cash
but
those.
Okay.
So we walked through the mall, and it was a nightmare. But yeah, what's not a nightmare is talking about 1993 IndyCar.
That's quite a segue. That is quite a segue.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, we're the master of segues here. We're always speaking of that, and
transition.
Yeah. It's those years of experience in video editing. But so we wanted to talk about the 1993 IndyCar season because it was kind of a massive year, and we needed an IndyCar expert. And as much as James was really talking about this earlier, how we understand things. I guess I'll just let you take it, James.
So Mark and I definitely are massive NASCAR fans, without a doubt. We do love all forms of motorsports, but our true passion and attention while we were children was NASCAR. I started watching in kind of the mid-90s, mainly in the truck series. Started to understand the Cup series 2000, 2001. Mark, I believe you started really understanding it 2005, 2006. You really were hooked into it. And for us, those were big peak years of NASCAR. So we were watching NASCAR at the height of it. Meanwhile, from what I remember with IndyCar and kart, I used to watch a little bit of kart because Target Chip Ganassi was the dopest looking team in the history of kart, in my opinion. Very relatable. And I've watched a little bit of IndyCar because they would come to tracks in Florida, and ESPN would have coverage too, kind of on the same days as the truck races. So you kind of would be exposed to it. But, I never really watched it. Mark, you also watched IndyCar and had a little bit of relationship because they have the street course in Toronto as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I didn't even go ever until this year.
It's okay. I never went to St. Pete Grand Prix until this year too, and that was in my backyard as well. So we're in the same boat.
I wouldn't go.
That's like having a car go down your street and be like, "Nah, I don't know what that is. I'm just gonna stay home."
I wouldn't go until somebody gave me credentials and it would be free. Then I finally went.
Yeah, because when you have credentials, that's it's a whole new world. And now Disney's
we're gonna get sued.
All right. Yeah, off key and everything. But yeah, I mean that's the thing too with us. We always like to go to events when we at this adult age we've reached. We want to be working. We don't want to just be there as fans. We really want to have a role while we're there, and it speaks to kind of what we do. But still, IndyCar is a very fascinating form of motorsport to me. I always look at it in my mind as the North American F1 because of, if you look at open wheel racing, the top pinnacle is F1. And then there's, of course, IndyCar in North America as a top series. And, there's a lot of cool things that happen with IndyCar. Obviously, the snake pit when the Indy 500 rolls around. The greatest spectacle in racing is the Indy 500. So it's a world-renowned race, and these Indy cars run it. So I think that's also another interesting aspect. Street courses, road courses, ovals. That's really cool. A F1 car on an oval. Can you imagine that, guys? I don't think anyone could really fathom that ever working out. But for some reason, IndyCar guys are able to do it, race in and race out. And of course, one of my favorite guys, Ed Carpenter, man, oval master. Took him forever to get his first win on an oval, but still, he was always ultra competitive, especially in that Menards car. That's our experience with IndyCar, I guess. To the extent of our NASCAR relationship, we love Indy cars on ovals, just because we like turning left real good and fast, and it's interesting. But Don, I mean, you can attest more to what IndyCar really is, and especially the time of the split when there was kart and IndyCar, distinctively two different categories of open wheel racing in North America.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is similar to what you just said, is the ability to be fast in all disciplines. And that actually is why the 93 season was kind of so interesting in itself, because, Nigel Mansell was coming over as the reigning Formula One champion. And the overall consensus was, he's going to do great on road and street courses, but he's going to suck on ovals. And right off the bat in Phoenix, he's in a practice crash, breaks his back, and so everyone's already that's the consensus there that Mansell can't drive ovals. As the season goes on, Mansell ends up becoming this expert on ovals and gets a majority of his points towards the championship on oval tracks. And the runner-up Emerson Fittipaldi ended up having more points than him on road courses, which I think was the most surprising aspect to that year. And I think that speaks to what an IndyCar champion is always been about, the ability to perform on all types of tracks. And I think that when you look at the modern day IndyCar schedule, it's probably lacking 1 to 2 ovals. It's not that far off from the schedule back in the mid 90s. But that ultimately is what is describing an IndyCar driver and an IndyCar champion, someone that can excel on all types of tracks, in all types of weather, all types of environments. And now more so than ever, it comes down to those tracks because the equipment is so similar. At least back in 93, for instance, which we'll talk about, at least back then, you had so many different pieces of equipment, whether that's chassis or engine, or as you got into the mid 90s, you had different types of tires. Then you had a little bit more disparity and even more variability in the races, whereas now everything is so similar that the discipline on those different types of tracks is what separates the champions to the backmarkers. So that's again, that's just building off of what you said, but that's really what IndyCar has always been about and should be about going forward.
And Mark, I'm pretty sure you can attest that's probably like how we watched IROC last week in our previous episode, where that's like the pinnacle of having all of these grand champions from different disciplines to prove who is the best. That doesn't really prove who's the best because they're all just driving some stock cars.
I was just going to say, yeah, grand champions all in stock cars, so the NASCAR guys just win every race. But,
yeah,
great, right?
But you know what? We proved that wrong last time because someone who wasn't a NASCAR driver won. But, in IndyCar, it's like you have all these different backgrounds with specific styles of tracks, and then also like in regards to different kinds of cars, because I remember Nigel Mansell talking about one race in particular where the Penske car in 93 was obviously the better car that weekend, and he flat out said in an interview, we had a great race weekend, but I just was in the wrong car. And it's like, to hear that, it's kind of odd because you don't normally hear that in NASCAR. You don't hear like someone saying, oh, this car is much better. If I was in that car, I would have won. But like, that's just how it is. And it's pretty blunt.
Yeah, I mean, different chassis would perform better in certain environments. Obviously Penske spent a lot of money and R&D specific to Indy, and there was their own chassis. Mm-hmm. And they might not have spent as much as for instance the Lola would on short ovals or natural road courses or things like that. So you had to pick your poison back then and decide where you were going to spend your R&D and your testing budget. You couldn't do it on all aspects. So yeah, you would have different races. You'd have different types of combinations or equations of equipment that would perform better. So that was really what made it truly interesting back then, and I think that's why it gained so much popularity.
Right on. So Mark, I think this is a great way for you to segue into kind of setting up what is the season we're looking at, the 1993 IndyCar season.
Yeah. So like Don said, it's kind of a crazy season because like looking back at it now, like with what I've learned about IndyCar and watching kart races and things like that, like just like look at what happened when like Alonso came over in 2017 to run the Indy, right? How big a deal that was. People were flipping out. It's like, my God, we got this F1 guy. And I felt like if everyone's like, but wait, like 93, like Mansell came over, and that was that was also a big deal. And that kind of made me read more about that, because I just thought that was so strange that somebody would leave in the pinnacle of their Formula One career and try something else. But I also thought that was super cool, and I wish more drivers were willing to try stuff like that. And I know there was different factors involved that made him come over. It wasn't just like, yeah, I've accomplished Formula One, I'm going to IndyCar. I know there was other stuff there, but it just, John, can you kind of talk about just how big a deal it was for him to come over and how good he did right off the bat?
Yeah, I mean, Alonso coming over is cool. Like, without a doubt, it's a cool story. It is nothing in the ballpark that Nigel Mansell coming over. I mean, this is the reigning Formula One world champion coming over, leaving Williams, and coming over to IndyCar. Not a champion 5-6 years ago. Not a champion that is retired for a couple of years and now coming back. This is the best in the world at the best time in his life from a racing career perspective, switching and coming to IndyCar. So the massive media attention was just absolutely enormous. So in Surfers, which is the opening race, they had 800 accredited media members for that race alone, just to kind of give a sense of just how popular. And that's in Australia. It's not exactly the easiest place for people to get to. So that's just how popular Mansell coming over was. And at the same time, you had this weird switch where Michael Andretti had left Newman Haas for McLaren in Formula One. So you had arguably the best driver in IndyCar at the time. He didn't win the championship. Rahal did, but he was second, 4 points behind. So you have arguably the best driver in IndyCar going to Formula One. And then you have what I don't think is arguably was the best driver in the world coming over to IndyCar. And so you had, such a great mix of storylines before the season even began. And so that's why there's just so much intrigue in 93 and so much intrigue in Mansell coming over. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, is how is he going to adapt on the ovals, and how is he going to perform at Indy? And, these are tracks and types of tracks that he's never seen before. A completely different car. So the Williams F1 had this automatic gearbox and, had the ability to do automatic suspension settings, from the computer from pit lane, and going to an IndyCar, which was much more heavy and, back to a sequential shifter and things like that. So it was almost a completely different car too. And so all of this was leading into the storyline of 93, which was really all about Mansell. And there's one thing about Nigel Mansell is like, he is drama. There's no doubt about it. He is an unbelievable driver, but like every weekend there was some sort of drama with Nigel, and it was great. That's what made it so entertaining. His pre-race interviews, his post-race interviews, whatever it was, you'd always get some piece of drama from Nigel, and that's what made 93 such a cool year.
Yeah, I remember hearing that he was just one of the hardest drivers to work with ever, for lots of, crew members and crew chiefs and owners just saying that, Mansell's one of the best drivers in the world, but like he's like the most difficult person to work with on earth.
Yeah, and you kind of like at the same time you kind of go, well, he's kind of earned it. If you're the best in the world and you're coming over to kind of what you probably view as a lesser series to an extent. You're coming in with racing against a bunch of Americans and whatnot, and you're coming over. I mean, you probably feel like you are the best, and so there's a bit of confidence, if you will, a bit of arrogance that's going to follow that, and that's what made it enjoyable. That's what made it entertaining, and that's part of where you talk about modern IndyCar. That's what it lacks. It lacks that drama between these driver personalities. Of someone that's coming over that is a reigning Formula One champion versus a guy that ran go-karts the other day, and he's in a back marker and he's trying to just hang on to his career. So that's what really made the series so entertaining, was that personality that was Nigel and what that year was going to bring.
And it's crazy too, because like I think something you should speak to is like how there was a swap too. Because though Nigel was coming over to the IndyCar, someone was going over to F1, and that was Michael Andretti. He had this deal with McLaren. Like, speak to that, because like that was kind of a big deal for Americans. You know, not many Americans get to compete at that level of racing. You know, what was that kind of pressure that was there, or the media attention that was there for to cover Michael?
Yeah, it was a long time coming. Michael was testing, first off with his dad already being over there and a world champion himself, but Michael was testing, I believe, early in '91 already in a Formula One car, and I think it was a McLaren too. So him and Ron Dennis were talking, for a while. Michael dominated '92 Indy. Ron Dennis was there, I believe, and then obviously his engine conks out with like 8 laps to go or something like that, and that kind of like sealed it for Michael to move on to his next phase in his life, which was trying Formula One like his dad did, and he was Senna's teammate, and Mario I think said it best, and it was the best possible situation at the worst possible time. There were just a lot of politics, the development of that chassis with McLaren, development of that program. And, in Formula One, you have an A driver and then you have the B driver, and, budget and time and effort gets spent towards the A driver, and the B driver is kind of there to support the team. And I think a lot of situations just got super highlighted. And, first off, Michael being Michael, and then, I think it just didn't work out due to a lot of different circumstances. But the attention was there. And as you could see in most of the races, if you watch most of those 93 races, at some point in the broadcast, there's always here's what Michael's doing in the Formula One race. So there was always interest. It was in the United States, those Formula One races were on so early, and they're on, a pretty niche cable channel. So it was pretty hard to actually keep up with it from a relatively live perspective. So you kind of relied on the IndyCar broadcast to give you a little bit of how Michael is doing, or you got a magazine that you'd get, 3-4 weeks after the race was completed. So, it was kind of like a huge ordeal, Michael going over there. Once he was over there, you kind of didn't hear a lot about it until, oh my God, now Michael's back. Kind of not middle of the season, but he didn't finish off the season in Formula One that year.
Yeah, and it's kind of going to end up being the polar opposite of the season that Nigel Mansell is going to have in '93, unfortunately. So the swap, as it were, didn't really work out for one of the drivers. But Michael did finish his career in Formula One with a podium finish, so that's kind of cool. He'll always have that. Yeah,
he was doing, as the season went on, he was starting to do a little bit better in terms of the results, I think. But Formula One is, a fairly cutthroat series. So, the results may not have been, specifically the reason why the relationship didn't work out. But it's funny because you think, 20 years later, Michael, still has that relationship with McLaren, and, McLaren came over as a partner to Andretti Autosport, 2 years ago with Alonso. So, it's funny how that relationship still was maintained even after the Formula One season didn't go as planned.
So looking now at at the Mansell thing. So to start the '93 season, Mansell comes over, he's driving for Newman Haas, and at the first race of the season, he wins the pole, leads 32 laps, and wins the race. So everyone's kind of blown away.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pole was actually probably the most surprising, just to immediately connect with the car. And what you found in a lot of races that year with Nigel is that he would kind of have, I'm going to either say struggle or trouble at the start of a race. Either he wasn't used to the rolling starts. Obviously in Formula One was standing starts, and I don't think he had done a rolling start for 20 or 30 years in his career. So I think that was something that he had trouble getting used to. So at Surfers, right at the start, he drops back to 4th or 5th, and Emo gets by, and PT gets by, and Robbie Gordon gets by, and I think even Mario got by him. So Nigel found himself really early on in the race, being passed by a bunch of people. That was consistent throughout kind of his whole year. And what Nigel would just do, though, he would just pick people off one after another, over the next 20 or 30 laps. And he had this like aggressive smoothness to the way that he was driving, his ability to kind of roll the car through the turns as opposed to kind of just like stopping and going and really being able to transfer the weight. And that was the big difference between Formula One and IndyCar. And, he was really able to do that throughout an event, and more so than any of the other IndyCar drivers. You'd see, these, Paul Tracy and Gordon just fly off the start, and then they would burn their tires out. And Nigel would, just consistently pick people off. And actually in Surfers, he had to make an extra pit stop. He got essentially a black flag. So everyone else made 2 stops, and Nigel made 3, and he made enough time up on the track that he made up for the 3rd stop and then some. So, right off the get-go that you were seeing, the benefits of, his Formula One expertise, his ability to conserve fuel, but also be aggressive at the same time and conserve his tires. All this, in a package, and you definitely got a sense of Nigel mania right off the bat in '93.
Yeah, and initially, like we when we picked a race from the season, we're like, oh, we should do Surfers because like I'm a massive Robbie Gordon fan. Like I grew up a huge Robbie Gordon fan. Like he finishes on the podium in a great race. Like, we have to do that one, but no, we figured we would go to the weird oval. So the season goes on. Mansell's gonna win 4 races leading up to the race we're going to go in depth on, which is the race at Nazareth, the second last race this season. And like you said, so he wins at Surfers and then wins 3 races on ovals, which are something that people thought would never happen. He finishes 3rd at Indy on an oval. Every other oval he wins. So
yeah, I mean, you got to also remember that not only does he do that well on ovals, but his first introduction to one, he breaks his back. Yeah. So it's not like he's going to have this unbelievable amount of confidence going into what was the Indy 500. He didn't race Phoenix because of the broken back. Gets some surgery and kind of shows up right when qualifying is starting. So he has to go through rookie orientation at Indy as your first real oval at speed. That's quite a jump. From let alone just being able to race at Phoenix, but quite a jump from going to Phoenix, breaking your back, not racing, going to Indy, hasn't shot at winning Indy. But again, just doing all of this, given those circumstances, with no experience. So all of that just really shows you just how talented Nigel was. And you always, back then, and still like even in Formula One today, like you look at teammates in terms of performance, not necessarily, especially when there's differences of cars, it's hard to kind of judge exactly, the performance of or talent of a driver versus, across teams. But when you look at that team, Mario won Phoenix that year. So that Mario was still on top of his game. And then throughout the year, Nigel just blew the doors off Mario throughout, each of those races. And even in Nazareth, which we'll talk about, but that just shows you just the talent level that Nigel had coming into IndyCar.
So is this the only time that F1 champions have been teammates on an IndyCar team?
I can't. Probably. I know that. I mean, Mo came over, but I don't know who is all of his teammates. I don't know if he ever was a teammate to Mario, and I don't know of any other F1 champions to come over. So I would have to say yes.
That's pretty crazy.
And something that's crazy too, you speak to how he broke his back. And something that a lot of people probably don't know is he didn't really spend a lot of time to recuperate before getting back in a car. Yeah, this was back in the day when you were hurt, you raced hurt. So speak to kind of what Nigel did, like, because he went from one extreme to another with this season, having this injury, and then also facing an illness at the US 500 as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was April. So he broke his back in April. And, obviously we all know the month of May was truly the month of May back then. It wasn't just, a one-day qualifying ordeal. So, he had essentially a month to recover from, a broken back. So again, that was, that was pretty spectacular in itself, and just again the ability to put the pain aside and not only just compete, but to compete for the win. Just really was incredible. And then, adding on to the lack of experience on ovals going into that, it was, but that's what made this series so watchable. Like every weekend, like I was saying, every weekend there was some kind of dramatic story with Nigel. So you had Surfers, which is the opening season, and then Phoenix, he breaks his back, and come Indy, he's recovering, and how's he going to do in his first attempt back, and then Milwaukee, again, he's finally how's he going to recover from a short oval, and ends up winning in Milwaukee, and just kind of goes every single race. There was such a dramatic storyline, and it really reminded you of that NASCAR type storyline of the early 2000s when you had Jeff Gordon, at the top of his game and things like that. And you always had a distinct reason to watch those races. And it wasn't to see, first through 26th, but it was to see how is Nigel going to do that race. And that was enough. That 93 was, again, such a dramatic season. And that's why everyone really, really grasped on IndyCar, because you had this character in Nigel, and every weekend there was a different story around him.
Wow. I mean, if that isn't selling you either tickets to go go to the race and sit your butt down and watch it, or just like tune in on like whatever media outlet was covering IndyCar at the time.
Right.
I don't know what will, because like that, there's so much drama from like race to race, like you spoke of, that it's like a soap opera kind of within motorsport.
It is. That's exactly right. And you had 4 or 5, distinct personalities. It wasn't like 15th place was going to have a shot at winning, where you could probably win today and starting that far back. But there were 4 or 5 major personalities that season, and that was enough to kind of build that storyline. And that reality show. I mean, reality show with motorsports. And you had Paul Tracy, this kind of pseudo rookie, and you had Robbie Gordon, this other pseudo rookie. And you had the veterans in Emo and Mario and Al Unser, and Ray Hall, and then you had this guy coming over from Formula One and Nigel, and that was enough. That's all you needed, and there was enough entertainment value between each of those drivers, and enough of the entertainment value race in, race out. That was. The racing almost became secondhand. It was just, I want to hear more what Nigel's going to say. I want to hear what Mario's going to say. I want to hear what PT is going to say. So it was almost secondhand what actually happened on the track as opposed to what was going on off the track.
Huh. And now something that we always like to talk about going off the track, more or less, kind of our icons, our personalities we know, are the broadcasters. Because for sure, they do transcend through different forms of motorsports, and especially when you have ESPN Speed World broadcasts, that really transcends everything. So, Mark, talk about who's in the booth and who's going to call this race from pit road.
Yeah, so we're going to go in depth here on the 1993 Bosch Sparkplug Grand Prix from Nazareth. Second last race of the season, and of course, this race is an ESPN Speed World broadcast. And in the booth, we have the legend, Paul Page, joined by our color commentator, Mr. Derek Daly.
All right. And on pit road, we have the man, John Yoibikis. And of course, Gary Gerald as well. They'll be giving you all the insights, doing all the things you need to do to get the scoop, get the know-how for you and everybody in the booth. And also, Paul Page always reminds me of that guy from The Princess Bride, even though he does not look like him at all. Like, you fool, you lose. That guy. I don't know why. I just think of that with Paul Page. Sorry, Paul. Love you.
Important thing to note is that the music on this broadcast in the early 90s, the music on ESPN Speed World was baller. Like, it was like
music was so great.
so bad, like 80s music, and I was like, man, it's unreal. Like they're 8-9 years behind the times on the music. It's great.
It's so perfect.
It's like they were kind of lost. It's like they didn't really know what to be, whether it was the 90s or the 80s, so they just kind of stuck with what they had. And it's flawless. It works.
Well, you have to pay so much for like a music bank. Maybe if it's still like nowadays, you got to use that thing up, right? It's like we licensed all this music, like we have to use it, So, but that'll lead us into our favorite segment of our show, which is Strange Starters. And we're really going to lean on Don here because I have a couple here who I'm pretty sure are strange, but like I don't know because I'm not Mr. IndyCar, so I don't know for sure. But James, who's our first strange starter?
Brian Till in number 99. Say No to Drugs. Penske Chevy from Norman Taylor. He actually ended up becoming a great sports car broadcast in the Grand Am days. I remember him when he would call the 24 every now and then on the Speed Channel. So Brian Till, Say No to Drugs was always an interesting sponsor to me. I always remember them like being associated with Kmart because they always had those ties in NASCAR with like the Kmart cars, whether it was like in NASCAR or ARCA, they would always do the Kmart / Say No to Drugs car. So it's kind of funny.
Yeah, doing some research, it looks like Brian Till had a pretty interesting foray over 3 years into IndyCar. Clearly never in a very good car, but you know, I do like to find when I find out that broadcasters raced, that I always find that super interesting, you know, because I feel like it makes them more legitimate as a broadcaster, especially when they are the play-by-play guy and not the color guy, because you assume that the color guy is going to have some background, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the NHL has a former hockey player as a color guy, but it's nice when you find out that the play-by-play guy also has a background, even though he's the more polished network guy. And I think, you know, Brian's going through some health issues right now, so all our best to Mr. Brian Till. And then Don, if you're looking at the Google Doc, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's last name, the next guy. So it's Dave. Is it Kudrave or Kudrave?
Dave Kudrave.
Kudrave, and he's driving the number 42 AGIP Lola Cosworth for Antonio Ferrari. And he's weird because he only made 7 career IndyCar starts. And that's pretty much all we got. Anyone else you want to mention, Don? You think it's weird?
I think the interesting one, Mark Smith was an interesting one in the sense that a Smith to date he was actually a solid rookie. I think he came out of Indy Lights. And you know, his second race, I think he got a top 10 in his first couple races. But he didn't qualify for Indy, and he was probably the best Smith to probably have a chance at qualifying for Indy, but there is yet to be a Smith qualify for last name Smith qualify for the Indy 500. So I think that was kind of interesting. He had a solid year, but just didn't put it together. You always had these you know, Ross Bentley, you know, just always kind of an always back marker. Obviously, you know, Hiro Matsushita with his Panasonic liveries and at Nazareth. Oh my God, you know, love Hiro, but man, he was slow. I think he ends up getting lapped in the first. I think it's like lap 4. He's already a lap down.
Yeah, they're lapping cars at like lap 5. Yeah, it's pretty crazy, man. It's like an ARCA race nowadays where they're lapping guys on lap 2. You know, it's like okay.
Yeah.
But
Willie Ribbs was in that race. You know, Willie was always a standout sports car racer, and you know, he probably could have had a better shot at IndyCar. He had a pretty solid year that year in terms of the amount of races he got in. But you know, I think I think you guys nailed it with the odd starters. So I think we're good.
The other thing I have to ask you, so you mentioned somebody getting a top 10. So we joke as people who do social media for race teams, we always joke, especially in sports cars and IndyCar, when people use the term top 10 finish because of how few cars there are. So like if you're a GTD team in IMSA, there's like 13 cars, and then you'll see
the LMP2
that they finished in a top 10. They're like, we got a top 10. And it's like, that's great. You finished 10th in a 13 car field. Congratulations. Or Indy Lights, where there's 11 cars. And you get top. So is the top 10 finish in IndyCar a real statistic?
When you had 26 starters, it is. When I would say, like, even in the Champ Car days, there were, you were pushing 17 starters. I don't think that is such a big deal. I think the top 10 also goes farther if or further, maybe it goes further. It goes further if the points line up closer to that. So back in those days, you get points first through 12th. So you get 1 point for a 12th place finish. So it would obviously have much more emphasis to get that top 10. Whereas now you get points to finish last and not even to finish the race. So I think it goes hand in hand with how the points are distributed. I would love to see the points actually come back to a first through 12th or even a first through 10th. And that way you could align a top 10 to actually mean something. And, it also would help from a broadcast perspective to allow, fans to focus on a battle, between 9th, 10th, and 11th. Whereas now it doesn't really matter. But it would if there was, a single point on the line between finishing 10th and 11th. So that's a long way around of answering your question.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes Formula One's midfield battle so interesting is that 10th place cutoff, right? It really, that's what I watch when I watch Formula One. I don't care who wins. I know it's going to be one of the top 3 teams, but I want to see who's going to finish 8th, because that's interesting. So, so continuing on though, we'll go to our pre-race notes. So this is an interesting race because it's set by points, and I'm not sure, was qualifying rained out?
Yeah, qualifying was rained out.
Okay, so qualifying is rained out. So Nigel Mansell's got the pole, and then that puts Fittipaldi in second, and they're fighting for the championship. And Mansell can clinch today if he finishes 23 points ahead of Mo at the end of the race. So it'll make the final race meaningless, but is what it is. So he's just been on a tear all season. So he's got to get a 23-point buffer. And Don, I'll ask you this. So a lot of people say that Nazareth drives like a road course. They kept saying that in the pre-race. So Fittipaldi should have the upper hand.
Yeah, it's a completely different course than Nigel's really ever been on. I mean, you could say Milwaukee Mile was close, but that is a relatively flat track, whereas Nazareth, I want to say it's like a 1.1 mile oval, something like that. It's not exactly a mile. I don't have it offhand, but and also you had huge elevation changes from turn 1 to 2 to 3, and you had essentially a flat out tri-oval, and then you have to downshift into 2 or 3 gears into turn, again, I'm getting mixed up, so I'm going to say turn 2 for the sake of conversation. And so it drove similar to an oval in the sense that you had to brake and downshift multiple times and elevation changes. So it really drove like a road course in that sense, but you were primarily using an oval setup. And so most of the teams going into 93, they did get a test day, but practice and qualifying was completely rained out. So most of them were relying on their Phoenix setup. And again, Nigel didn't race in Phoenix. So Nigel, although on the pole, he had limited experience altogether at this track. So it was going to be an uphill battle just to maintain the championship lead where he's at, let alone clinch it.
And the other note we have is that Raul Boesel broke the track record in the morning warm-up, but it is speculated that he had a very low fuel load. But he did break the track record. So he was quite upset that he didn't get a chance to do qualifying because he feels like he probably would have gotten the pole. And we can debate the merits and purpose of morning warm-up sessions for days, but we won't get into that. But getting into the race. So we're actually going to wave off the start because the cars are out of order. So that's cool because in lots of racing series, they don't bother doing that. They just, you're all out of line. We'll just penalize all of you. Yep. But it's nice that they wave it off. I think that's really cool because I remember seeing some IRL races where they come off turn 4 and Scott Sharp's supposed to have the pole and he's in like 5th. They're like, what? And they just throw the green flag and they go for it. So nice to see them actually wave the start off. And I made a note that NASCAR should start doing this because it would just make more sense. But that would make sense. So NASCAR won't do that. And Fittipaldi's going to jump out in the lead right away. Like Don said, how Mansell kind of struggled on the starts in a lot of races. So Mansell's going to drop to 3rd right away. Fourth by lap 2. He's going to drop Fittipaldi, Tracy, and Boesel are all going to get around them. So
it's a trend of rolling starts. You just can't get them right. But then again, it's hard to kind of still get them right in your first year. And also with like the amount of pressure that's on him in this race, he's trying really not to crash or do anything out of the ordinary. He knows that he's going to get comfortable with every lap he runs in on the circuit.
By lap 5, I think we were joking about this earlier, but Fittipaldi and Tracy are already starting to lap guys. So there's a clear difference in performance between the cars, which is really like back in this day, kind of shocking. Like James and I always kind of joke that NASCAR was a lot more. There's a lot more parity in the mid '90s, and it seems like that's the absolute opposite in IndyCar.
Yeah, as Don mentioned, like having the specific chassis. Don, what do you think was the best chassis probably for the oval tracks back in the day? Flat oval.
I mean, obviously, Penske did well at Indy, so I got to give, Penske that upper hand. But the Lola that year was probably all around the best chassis to go with.
And then on lap 11, our good Canadian boy Paul Tracy's going to take the lead. So he's kind of did that a lot, kind of really fast early on in races, but we'll see how that plays out. And then around lap 15, I love IndyCar in-car cameras in this era, and the mounted cameras. My God, I could watch that in-car off the right side of the car like for days. It's so interesting, man. Just watching Mansell drive through traffic on an oval, like you said, Don, where you have to downshift, you have to really drive the car. It's not a traditional kind of open wheel oval where you're just driving around flat all the time. Like you're really having to work the car, and just seeing him go around cars that are way slower than him and navigate this traffic, it's just really cool to watch.
I think Derek Daly was in the booth, right? Something like that. And I think he said, Nigel's passed more cars in this race than he has in his entire career, which is probably pretty accurate. Just the amount of lap traffic that he had to work through throughout this race. I think it was a pretty fair statement.
And then we get to see some awesome racing, like back farther on in the pack, around lap 35, lap 40. Like there really are some great battles going on for 7th, 8th, although most of those guys are already a lap down. So, but they're racing each other. And then on lap 40, Mansell starts to figure things out. He gets back and gets around Fittipaldi, and by lap 47, he's actually going to take the lead. But we got some drama at this point because a lot of drivers are starting to complain that the cars are very loose. And apparently this is an absolute nightmare at Nazareth. So guys are pitting off sequence and pitting very early to try and make adjustments.
Yeah, and I think part of that was due to the lack of, first off, it's going to be a completely green track because it rained. So any existing rubber from anything was off, but they didn't get any practice time as it was. They got 2 30-minute warm-ups that day. So that was about it. And you can only replicate a race traffic versus a warm-up traffic so much. So I think a lot of people overshot the amount of downforce to have on it, and so they had to pull off some wing in order to help facilitate some of that oversteer.
And through this cycle of pit stops, Nigel Mansell will actually take the lead from Paul Tracy, which is big because were there bonus points back in the day for leading laps in IndyCar?
No, you get a bonus point for the pole. You might get one for most laps led, but I don't even know that was. I know you got one.
I don't think so. No, I think it was just the pole. Yeah.
But
he didn't get the point for the pole because there was no qualifying. So
yeah, exactly. So no one got points for that. But PT, you just you gotta love Paul Tracy because he just did not care, and he was out of the championship hunt. He knew that as a team player, he needed to allow Mo to get the best finishing spot in order to have Team Penske have a shot at staying alive in the championship. And early on in the race, PT's going 3 wide to pass Mo. And you could just see Mo lift just because you got to just be like, what are you doing, Paul? Like, come on, man. Just hang. You know that I got to be leading this race, and PT just didn't care. And that's what you loved about him as a driver. He went 100% nonstop. Didn't matter who he's driving for, what the situation was. This was no different.
And speaking of not caring, my boy Robbie Gordon is going to do some Robbie Gordon things like he did his whole career and refuse to move out of the way for the leader when he's trying to lap him. So he's getting in Mansell's way. Mansell's shaking his fist at him and freaking out. And that's just classic Robbie Gordon, man. He's like, I want to stay on the lead lap. You're going to have to pass me, man. And that's just what he does.
Mind you, he's in 5th place, too. So that's how many cars now are left on the lead lap. Only 4 cars. That's crazy. We're only at lap 65, and he's already doing this.
Yeah, and you just don't, and that's what you don't get. So there is good and bad for that, right? So the bad being, you know, you're really down to truly a handful of drivers that can win. The good being that it's real easy to make heroes out of a handful of drivers versus 20 drivers, and really define storylines with 2 or 3 drivers versus 20 drivers. And so it's part of the rub with the current IndyCar, because literally at any given weekend, anyone can win. You know, at least top 15, you probably have a shot at winning. But that makes it a little bit more difficult to tell stories when you don't know exactly as a fan who to concentrate on and whatnot. And from a broadcasting perspective, they knew that they were going to concentrate on Nigel and Emo that entire day. And, you know, sure, there's going to be some other stuff every now and then, but the storyline was Nigel. Whereas today, there's so many different opportunities throughout a race that it's actually a little bit more difficult to maintain.
Yeah, I listened to the radio broadcasts of Laguna this year, the championship deciding race, and they really only talked about Joseph Newgarden a couple of times. And he was like gonna win the title. You know what I mean? They didn't really talk about it very much. They had so much to talk about. They were talking about Herta and Dixon and Pagenaud and all this different stuff. And I was like, shouldn't we be talking about the guy who's gonna win the title? But whatever, you know.
Yeah, I mean that's why it's like good and bad. Like it's a tough one. It's a tough one to kind of quote unquote legislate. Like you can't like necessarily force it to happen, especially as long as there's spec racing. But that's what drove IndyCar in the 90s, was the ability to truly focus on 1, 2, or 3 drivers, and that's it. And you know, the drivers that we talked about earlier in the race, I don't think they were mentioned at all throughout the broadcast. Kudrave, you know, you had all these guys, and the only time Hero was mentioned is when he's getting lapped because he's so slow. But that was the nature of IndyCar, that you had stars and you had everyone else. Whereas now you have a whole group of people that are really similar in talent and speed, and sometimes it's hard to build villains out of it. It's hard to build heroes out of it. So, anyways, that's my rant for the day, I guess.
Oh, no problem. And then lap 70, Nigel Mansell is going to make his first pit stop. Pit stop's kind of like not really a factor in this race. Nothing really exciting on pit stops because it's a very, very green race. And then lap 75, Little Al Unser Jr. is going to have to retire from the race with an engine failure. So unfortunate end to
he had a tough year that year. The Gallus chassis was pretty far behind from an R&D perspective. Obviously, he won Indy 92, but they just struggled really all year. And I think that played into a big factor in Al going to Penske in the following year.
And lap 87, Mansell's now lapped up to 4th place. So he's lapped Emerson Fittipaldi now, who he's racing for the title. So it looks like he's going to get the title in the bag, depending on where Emo's going to end up finishing. But now he's got a whole lap on him. And then as we cross the 100-lap mark, we realize there's not been any cautions in this race yet, which, if you look at the 1993 schedule, seemed to be something that happened more than a couple of times. No cautions. So kind of interesting. Nowadays, like, very rare to see a race go completely caution-free.
Especially at a track like that. I mean, the idea of Nazareth with that slow and difference between lap traffic and leaders, you just assume that there's going to be some kind of accident happening. And yeah, that was definitely a pretty rare occasion. Not only not an accident, but not an engine failure that was enough, or anything like that was enough to bring out a caution.
And kind of with that, James, like, I don't know if you could figure out while watching it, but I had no idea what the running order was this entire race.
Yeah, I'll attest to that too because of my nerd knowledge of tickers and timing and scoring evolution in racing. Really, the constant ticker really didn't come about until the mid 90s when CBS really started doing it for the Daytona 500, and also ESPN's partner ABC would do it for the Indy 500. So really, we didn't have the constant timing and scoring like we did, kind of to attest to Don's like mentioning of the fact that we didn't have like constant ways to keep up with Michael Andretti's endeavors in Formula One. It just was kind of a product at the time. And to think about it too, like think about on pit road, they're probably still kind of like, doing some manual timing and scoring, even though there was electronic timing and scoring. Probably everyone didn't have access to that. So it's kind of hard to figure out who's on the lead lap, who isn't. It's just kind of like a blur of cars, but we all kind of know who the main three contenders are in the race because they are within somewhat of proximity of each other throughout the race. But it's just really, really difficult. But,
yeah, and that goes back to now I'm sounding like I'm beating a dead horse here, but it goes back to there are 1 to 2 characters, 1 to 2, 3, 4 characters throughout a race that you just know that's who you're gonna concentrate on, and you concentrate on Nigel, and you knew where he was at, and you kind of knew where Emma was at, and that's really all that mattered. And as a fan, that was the story that you were watching, and you weren't really watching the battle in 7th, 8th, 9th, and you didn't really care. It was what was Nigel doing, where was he at, and was he going to win the championship? And that's just it was much more simplified than it is today, but that is also a reason for its success.
Yeah, and that's kind of just the way that cookie crumbles, kind of, if you think about it. On lap 112, Scott Goodyear, he's running really great. He's in second place, and he's really the only other car on the lead lap at this point now, guys. We've gotten to the point where 2 cars are on the lead lap. This is kind of reminiscent of Dover, like, 4 years in the future, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, it's a really ultra competitive race, and obviously, I don't know what chassis Goodyear's on. Is he in a Lola, if I'm not mistaken?
He's also in a Lola, yes.
That just attests to me to the package that Lola has, and the fact that Scott's team and of course Nigel's team were able to get the setup right with the amount of downforce needed, and also kind of conserving themselves and having a good pace. And there's also like the playing with boost. From what I've understood, I've heard Nigel speak about it once in the 1993 season, where you can crank the boost and you can run like 6th gear, but if you have to do it just right so you don't pop off the valve. And once you pop off the valve, you're basically done. So it's like a fine line. So maybe they just have their engines tuned just right as well in with those Lola chassis.
They had the magic package. I mean, that package, beyond the Penske's, the Lola Ford, and that was also what Newman Haas was running. And, Walker had the latest chassis and the latest Ford. So that Lola Ford combination was definitely, it might not hit you a home run, but it would get you at least to third base on most of the races.
So on lap 125, Arie Luyendyk and Robbie Gordon, they're battling for third. Robbie, he's still doing great. He's going for that podium, but Luyendyk is hoping for a great run in his Ganassi car to impress owners, because he's not coming back to Ganassi next year, because Michael's going to a Ganassi, Michael Andretti. So that's kind of a big move for Arie to be showcasing that he has that oval ability. As the next race will be on a road course, so he's trying to flex that oval muscle. Lap 140, ish, as we've kind of made it in our notes, Mansell makes his final stop. So probably comes in on lap 139. The team goes to work. And guys, we got to mention how flawless pit stops were back in the day. Nowadays it's like machine work, with the way these guys go over the wall, and gals at times on some crews go over the wall, and they put the fuel in, get the tires off in roughly around 5 seconds. Back then, there were some variables to pit stops. Obviously, sometimes the driver wouldn't hit the box right. Sometimes you wouldn't get each tire wouldn't get off in sequence. But man, that Newman Haas crew was just flawless throughout the race, and making the right adjustments too as the race went on.
And then we're going to start getting chat about the team orders in the Penske camp. So Don mentioned this earlier, but is Penske going to make Paul Tracy pull over and let Fittipaldi get by him to gain extra points? So kind of talking about that in the final stages, which I don't think ends up happening, because I think Fittipaldi's kind of already out of it. So there's really no point in swapping the cars, which is something we see a lot in like modern Formula One, but it's not really going to come into play. And then there's not really a lot of notes for kind of the rest of the race. They just kind of ride, do their thing. The average speed's 176 miles an hour because of no caution, so that's pretty crazy. And then on lap 200, Mr. Nigel Mansell is going to sail to the win, and he's also going to get the championship, which, as someone who's a photographer in auto racing, just makes the podium that much simpler for all of us. Just, you know what? The final race of the season, win the race and the title, so we only have to go to one podium.
Yeah, those big teams like Getty and, LAT probably back in the day, they didn't have to be like, all right, one guy goes to the podium, the other guy's going to championship celebration. No, let's just all come to the same place and make it easy on each other.
What made it really interesting that I kind of forgot was that Nigel, before the race, actually signed a multi-year extension with Newman Haas. So the idea was that Nigel was going to be back not only for 94, but also for 95. And so the idea was, you're going to have, Nigel Mansell racing in 95 versus Jacques Villeneuve and Michael Andretti and all that kind of stuff. That would have been quite a cool thing to see. But obviously Nigel's contract only lasted into 94 through 94, and then went back to Formula One for the 95 season. But that's something that I think kind of gets lost, that actually Nigel was expecting from a fan perspective and from Newman Haas perspective to be back for 2 more years, not just the 1 more season.
So when they get in the podium, they hand the trophy. That Mansell initially seems kind of like meh about winning the title, but then he gives Carl Haas a huge hug and he's getting right into it.
But Nigel's drama, that's what he has to make it sound like something like, oh, this isn't a big deal, but then he starts getting emotional. But that's why that was Nigel. I mean, the guy just dominated Nazareth, never been there before, didn't have any practice time, clinched a championship in his first year, and he makes even what should have been the most obvious kind of victory circle interview, he makes it Nigel, and he makes it add some drama to it, and that's what made it so great.
Something I find funny too is even before all that happens, he's coming on a cool down lap, and he continues to ask exactly where Fittipaldi finished in the points. He's like, where did he finish on track? So I know that I beat him in the points. He was never assured of himself, even though the crew kept telling him, you won the title, you're the champion. It was just so weird to kind of see that with him, but it and also how reserved he was. He was like, I am the champion, I am. But then later on, he comes around and he's like, no, the team won the championship. We are the champion team. It's like, all right, Nigel, it's all good. I know it took a lot for you to win. And honestly, if you look at a driver's performance, every track he went to that year was new to him. Everything he did about that year was foreign, and he accomplished it, and he was great. I mean, he only had 2 bad finishes at Mid-Ohio and at Phoenix, like you spoke of. Oh, and Detroit as well, when he was taken out by a safety car. But other than that, I mean, he had a flawless season. Any rookie would be proud to have a season like that, especially if their first year, and to claim the title would be amazing.
Yeah, I think you gotta ask, is Nigel one of the best ever? To be able to. So what was even more funny is that the Formula One season had not been decided yet at the completion of Nazareth. So Nigel actually, technically, at that time, was the Formula One world champion and the IndyCar world champion at the exact same time, because they have not given the new Formula One champion yet. They haven't crowned him yet. So that was, I thought that was pretty interesting. And so you gotta say, is Nigel one of the best ever? And there's not a lot of drivers that have been able to cross over disciplines and be successful. I know that people are going to talk about equipment, but there's the Juan Montoyas. You have Jacques Villeneuve that won in IndyCar, and then 2 years later won the world championship. And Nigel going the opposite way, again, I think is in that ballpark. In some of the best ever, and I think that '93 just showed how talented he was, and I would definitely have to put him in the ballpark for one of the best ever.
Yeah, and I feel like not enough people talk about Mansell, as being the best ever. It's not even like a person who comes to mind when people start talking about, greatest driver of all time. Obviously, we can't name one driver because there's so many different types of racing that exist in the world. So I always hate the debates where it's like, oh, this guy's clearly the better driver. It's like, no. Is Lewis Hamilton the greatest driver of all time? He's never done anything outside of Formula One. Right? Is it Kyle Busch? Is it whoever? Right? People always want to argue this. Is it Mario Andretti and AJ Foyt? But it's hard. But I think Mansell's name has to be in there to a certain extent because people forget that at one time he was the reigning champion of the two biggest open wheel series in the world.
Right, and I think that's what Alonso is trying to do. Like Alonso is trying to show that, hey, not only did I win in Formula One, but I can win in sports car racing and I can win the Indy 500. And so his legacy, he wants to create a legacy that puts him as one of the best. And so he knows in order to do that, he's got to get out of a couple of different disciplines and win in those disciplines. So I don't know enough about Lewis Hamilton, to be honest, but that's someone where he's been so dominant in Formula One that he's probably worried if he were to go somewhere else and not win, that would tarnish his legacy more so than, maintaining, where he's at in Formula One. He kind of has everything to lose and not much to gain at this point in his career, but that would be the equivalent. Like imagine Lewis Hamilton coming over and competing in IndyCar next year. Just imagine that circus. That was somewhat close to Nigel, but I think even back then Nigel was even a bigger deal.
And that kind of attests to why maybe we don't see too many drivers try to do what, for example, Fernando Alonso has done once they've finished their F1 career, to take a step to maybe say, oh, I'd like to try IndyCar.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just tough now. It's tough with how good everybody is. You know what I mean? It's very hard to get good. Like James and I, we loved when there used to be road course ringers in NASCAR, like when Tommy Kendall would show up and smoke everybody. Those were the days. That's not a thing anymore because all these kids grow up driving on road courses now. They grow up specializing in driving a stock car from the time they're 9 years old. So it's just not going to happen nowadays. And same thing in all these other forms of racing. You really have to put your focus in that one form of racing. You're never going to see another guy like Mario Andretti flying all over the world, across the Atlantic 30 times in 1 year to do all this different racing. It's just not going to happen now. But Mansell, I think, did it the right way. I'm going to stop Formula One. I'm going to come over. I'm going to do the IndyCar thing, focus on that. And he was able to win the championship by focusing solely on that and having it be, his main thing. So I think he did it the right way. Couple other things just from the podium celebration I want to mention is his plug for the Dirt Devil. Amazing. His sponsor. How if you're looking for a good Hoover, Dirt Devil's the best. So that's great. Paul Newman, just seeing him, anything to do with motorsports when Paul Newman's there is incredible. Gets A+ from me. And then Paul Tracy's nerd glasses are just solid, man. Those are some of the best glasses I've ever seen on a man. So those looked incredible. Another fun thing from this race. And the last thing I want to mention is NASCAR. It's okay if someone clinches the title a race early. It's okay. It happened here and no one cared. No one was like, well, now we all have to go to another race and it's stupid and pointless. No. You get another race, which is great. Yes, the championship's already been decided, but it's still fun. We don't need to have elimination playoffs. But that's a discussion for another day. John, is there anything else you want to mention about this awesome 1993 just caution-free craziness at Nazareth?
No, I just think it's for those of you who are listening that are fringe IndyCar fans or not IndyCar fans at all, I think it wouldn't hurt to put on YouTube while you're at work on your second monitor and watch a couple races. The storylines are great. It's super entertaining and kind of gives you a better sense of what IndyCar is all about. For those of you that are IndyCar followers of today and just didn't have a chance to be alive back then. I think that is also a great way to connect the past to the present, and see where where IndyCar could be heading back to, which is that level of popularity and back to its roots in terms of horsepower and in terms of entertainment value. So it's not just a back in my day type deal. I think it's important to understand the history of the sport, and understand what made it great, and to try to replicate those things, and it tells a lot of stories that you may never have known.
I don't think it could have been said any better there. Like, that's nail on the head.
And that's really why we wanted to start doing this podcast, is look back on old races and really see people, or show people, how we got to where we are today. I think is really interesting. And that's kind of why I wanted to do my NASCAR Twitter account. Just, I love when people are like, man, I never knew that guy drove that car, or I never knew that, that guy was so good at that point in his career, or that weird paint scheme. And I love hearing people say that, because it's just cool to kind of share that with people. And and there's something to be said about just fans getting together to talk about things. I love it. And I think it's nice that, as much as we've all had experience working in motorsports or currently work in motorsports, to still look at everything as fans and kind of discuss amongst ourselves just as fans of the sport.
Fully agree. I mean, it's always fun to be able to have opinions with other passionate people about any topic, and as long as it's cordial, it's always you always learn something. So fully agree.
Oh yeah, we always got to take away something from the conversation. You can't just be narrow-minded, and I think that's something that watching old races allows you to do. It expands the thought process for any viewer, even if it's just background noise.
For sure.
But the last thing that we have to do is rate the race. So we'll let Don go first. So Don, if you had to give this race a ranking, so we rank them based on a bunch of different things. You can be as slanted and biased as you want, totally. Basically, out of 10, you take into account, like, was the racing good, the historical significance. You could really just bring in any criteria you want.
What's our scale? Is this 1 to 10? Is this 8?
1 to 10. 1 to 10. And James likes to use decimals. Like, I go to 0.5s, but James will be like, give this race like a 6.897. But you don't have to do that. I would just you can do 0.5s. I like 0.5s, but I don't go beyond that.
I give it a 5. I give it a 5 based on other races that year. I think that it lacked the drama that everyone wanted. I think everyone wanted MO and to do something that carried into the final race of the season, and to really see more of a climatic finish. I think the lack of the yellow actually hurt possible circumstances and different variables. So 5 based on the other races that year. That would be my ranking. So I feel like that's an unbiased opinion.
That's fair. James, what would you give this race?
I'm going to have to, along with Don's criteria, based on the 1993 season, because watching the year in review and you see how much was going on between each race, this one is much more tamed. But it's still a good race. I'd give it a 5.1, just to be like the Price is Right guy. 3.99.
Yeah, $3.99.
A penny. Yeah. But honestly, I'm with Mark there. And Don, I'm with you 100%. Like, it's great to watch this race and kind of get a grasp of the season. But what this race to me will be is that race that'll be like, okay, I gotta watch Surface Paradise now. I gotta watch Phoenix. I gotta watch the Indy 500. Like, you're gonna want to dive into the entire season to understand the entire context of the storylines that were presented in this race. And to me, that's what makes this race more than passable.
Yeah, Indy was great that year. Man, that was a good race. It's such an underrated race, and it doesn't have that classic Indy finish, but throughout the race, has some great racing and great storylines. So I definitely recommend for anyone listening to watch Indy 93.
Oh, for sure. I mean, especially with, Nigel isn't bulletproof in that race. He does have some errors, which are kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But 5.1 for me, obviously a 5, but it's a great one to put on, have some background noise, listen to it, tune in, when you hear something great, and it'll open up a gateway for you to want to look into the 1993 season further. Mark?
So I was also going to give it a 5, but I'm going to give it a 6 because of the Dirt Devil Hoover thing at the end. It gives it a whole point. Because I already got to race the race on entertainment, and the fact that they interviewed his wife in the victory celebration, which I thought was like super weird. They're like, let's go to his wife now. What do you think? And she's like, well, I'm gonna say some nice stuff about America because what the hell else would I say? So that was kind of like hilarious. So it gets a 6 from me. Robbie Gordon finishes 4th, and you have a Canadian on the podium, so it gets a 6 for me just for those things.
Robbie Gordon got shut out of that podium, man. I want to protest. Robbie Gordon should have been on the podium for AJ Foyt, man. Just saying.
I totally forgot he even drove for AJ Foyt until we watched this race. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, his first endeavor in open wheel racing was technically for AJ Foyt. That must have been a falling out, if anything, because I just imagine the minds probably did not mesh as well as people would have thought they would have. But oh well. From what I've heard, AJ Foyt is a very hard person to drive for.
I imagine.
I can imagine, yeah. But, we'd have to get Robbie on here to tell his stories about that season. And, of course, how he definitely won that race in Canada, Mark.
Yes. That's never going to happen, though. I doubt we'll be able to ever be able to get Robbie Gordon. But
never say
maybe one day. So, yeah, well, Don, thanks a lot for joining us. It's been a lot of fun just to kind of rap about 93 IndyCar for the last, hour and 10 minutes. And it's just cool to have, an outside voice tell us all about things that we don't understand. So,
thanks for having me on, and thanks to all the listeners that have stuck with us this long. Appreciate it.
Well, we always talk about this. Like I was told podcasts should never be longer than 45 minutes. But nowadays, man, when you listen to like Joe Rogan or Dinner with Racers, they're like 4-hour podcasts and they get listened to like crazy. So I'm all about long podcasts. I got nothing wrong with long ones. So
oh yeah, because for me, I'm always either listening to them on a plane or on in the automobile when I'm like driving long distances, and I want to consume a lot of content. And I'm also the kind of guy that when you're listening to the podcast, I'm not sure if Mark or Don, you do this as well, that sometimes I'll start to feel like I'm a part of the audience, and I'll be like, yeah, and I'll agree with the people and start talking out loud. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm listening to something that's on my phone right now. What am I doing? But, I think people enjoy us. People are listening to this point in the podcast. And Don, I learned a lot today about IndyCar. Loads of it. I don't consider myself an expert. So when you were on here, I had ears perked up, really trying to absorb everything you were telling me, and that was really, really great, insightful to have you on the podcast. We're definitely going to have you back on, whether we're covering IndyCar races or maybe even the 2007 season when a lot of open wheel drivers started to jump into NASCAR forte.
Yeah, for sure. Anytime, and maybe I'll see you guys at the Daytona 24 this year.
Oh yeah, we'll be there.
You'll probably see us. We'll be awake for 40 hours and being crazy, and yeah, I'm sure we'll have time to meet up and chat.
Sounds good.
All right, man. Take care.
All right, guys.
See you. Have a good one.